Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Very much looking forward to this session on Europe's startup and innovation ecosystem and how to bring basically Asia and Europe together. The session title is basically Europe's ecosystem is coming to Asia, but I think what Fleur Pellerin is doing is also bringing Asia to Europe. I think it's going both ways. Let me first start by asking you to give us a quick overview. Obviously, that's a little bit of a challenge of saying this maybe in 2 or 3 minutes only, but what's your take on the innovation startup ecosystem in Europe at the moment? What are the key trends that you're seeing at the moment?
So just to give you the framework, I used to be the Minister for Digital and Innovation and Small Businesses in the French government from 2012 to 2014. Then I was Minister for Foreign Trade, and then I was Minister for Culture and Communication. But what I realized when I was Minister for Digital was that in France we have a great ecosystem, a great tech ecosystem, great startups, great engineers, great entrepreneurs. But if you go abroad, if you travel to Tokyo, if you travel to Seoul, if you travel to Hong Kong, people will always think about France as the country of food, of wine, of Chanel bags, but never as a country of tech. So I felt a bit frustrated about that, and I really wanted to change the image of France. Because right now what I was feeling was that there was really a change in the ecosystem, not only in France, but in Europe as a whole, with a lot of computer science specialists, a lot of people in the data science, a lot of people already working on AI. So I could see that maybe in the next revolution, digital revolution, there would be some very interesting success stories in Europe. So my take today is that really Europe has become a great continent for innovation, and that definitely it should be interesting for investors.
What kind of individual differences do you see across countries? You've already mentioned France, of course, but is there anything that is striking or standing out in terms of individual differences?
Maybe some countries appear more specialized in one or two verticals. Of course, the UK used to be more specialized in fintech because, of course, London was a very important financial place. But it might change a bit because of Brexit. Now some other countries might try to also become more prominent in the fintech sector, but it's still the case. Nordic countries or Baltic states are also very interesting at the moment, and we see amazing success stories. I recently invested with my venture capital fund in Taxify, which is a competitor to Uber in Europe and in Africa now. And it's an amazing success story. Only 5 years of existence, already number 2 in big cities like Paris, for example, just after Uber. And the CEO is a guy who is 25. So a new generation of entrepreneurs with very edgy technological advance. Right now, some of you might have heard about the fact that Google Maps are becoming more expensive for people who use the Google Maps for their applications. And so, for example, Taxify is now developing its own mapping system and ETA, estimated time of arrival algorithm, to become more independent of Google. So that shows a technological edge that is really remarkable. So Baltic countries and probably now Eastern Europe countries are becoming very deep tech proficient, I think. And in France, I think we have a sort of unique combination between very good engineering, very good scientific training, and creative, because we have a long history of creative industries in the cinema, in the animation. So we have an interesting combination, an interesting cocktail between really edgy tech expertise and creative drive, I think.
Thank you. Maybe some of you might have seen that my colleagues on in our newspaper division at the Economist Group, the Economist weekly newspaper, published an issue which was looking at startups. On the cover it said Peak Valley, why startups are going elsewhere, basically leaving Silicon Valley. Do you see any kind of drain from the Valley basically going into Europe, or perhaps that they're going elsewhere, but do you see some kind of changes in Europe at the moment there?
Maybe not drain, I would not call it that way for now, but what we see is that there used to be much more money, for example, in the Silicon Valley for investments in startups, and now you see that American funds are becoming more interested in investing in European startups, so you see more venture capital money in Europe, and that's really a trend that is really very strong right now. What is also interesting for investors, for example, is that the valuations are very high in the United States, and some of you might be exposed to the valuations of startups, successful startups in the US know that they are very, very expensive. It's more reasonable. It's starting to rise also in Europe, but it's definitely more reasonable. And also from a founder point of view or from a corporate point of view, startup point of view, what is probably different is that eventually, I think it's quite easy to do business in Europe. Of course, different countries have their different regulations, and each country has its singularity, but it's quite easy to do business. The tax environment has a bad reputation, but it's not so bad, actually. I mean, you know, when you compare the tax rate, the corporate tax rate in California and what it is in Europe, it's lower in most countries in Europe. And also, what you will find is better, I think, better deals in human resources. So I think you have a lot of very proficient engineers, as I said before, and they're probably much cheaper because of lower wages, because also of tax credits that are very good incentives for R&D, especially R&D centers. So it makes the price of a very good engineer, of a very good researcher, much cheaper than what it would be in the Silicon Valley. So all these, you know, more capital, very good engineers, cheaper labor forces, big loyalty also to companies. You don't see people switching from one company to another. All this makes it probably interesting to look at Europe right now. And I think my Asian partner is really a good example of that, because my investors are Naver and Line, that you probably know, all of you here. And they probably did not think of Europe as an interesting territory for either M&A or R&D 5 years ago, but now they've seen that something is going on and worth exploring.
That would have actually been my next question. So who are you bringing Asian investment to Europe? So who are these investors? You've just mentioned them, obviously. But can you elaborate a little bit more on what's driving this interest in Europe at the moment for investors from Asia? In particular, obviously, these investors seem to be coming from South Korea. Perhaps you can also explain a little bit if there's investment from other countries as well, perhaps.
Sure. So the rationale behind the creation of this venture capital fund at first was a bit vision. It was really a common vision about the future of digital economy, and our common conviction was that it's not really sound for an economy to be totally dominated by only two countries, American big corporations, or two countries, America and China. And what we see now, after the first platform revolution, now is AI revolution, what you see that it's going to be very difficult for European or Southeast Asian or Asian economies to compete with these superpowers that we have today, and that can have a lot of cash, have a lot of big market positions. So that it's very difficult to go against this winner-takes-all and network effects. So if we want to be able to compete, maybe there's a way in combining our strengths. And I think that maybe we should try to take advantage of skills and know-how and strengths of European corporations, European champions, and mix them with Asian champions. So it's more easy to say than to implement, but that's the basic idea. So we decided to create a venture capital fund with Naver and Line. It has now 200 million euros to invest. And so our idea is to invest that money in Europe, to find in Europe companies, startups that have the potential to become European champions, or maybe worldwide champions. That's what we hope. And we try to give them, through Naver and Line, we try to give them access either to the Asian market or to Asian partners or to technologies that Naver can, for example, have developed. So we really try to create this synergies, industrial or financial or business synergies, that can help the companies grow and potentially to become competitors to the big giants. So that's our idea. And maybe when we think of the future together, because we have a very good business relationship, we could probably at some point do the same for Asian companies who are interested in the European market, because it's the same kind of logic or philosophy. But maybe that's for 2 years from now or something like that. But that's basically the idea.
From the perspective of the European startups, how does the Asian market look like for them? How attractive is that market? Trying to target that market as well. Obviously, using that Asian investment, you're bringing them here. From their perspective, what attracts them to Asia, basically, apart from your funding, obviously?
Yeah, so that was a big question actually, because we, I think, one of the only funds in France and even in Europe to propose this Asian angle. Of course, when you have a successful company in Europe, you were tempted, I think, to if you wanted to scale your business and to grow global, you were tempted by the American market first. But now this has changed, and we see companies who want to expand and who want to expand east before expanding west, which is very interesting, a very interesting move. Because when we launched the fund in January 17, we were not sure that our value proposition, building this bridge to Asia, would work, and that we would find companies interested in that kind of incentive. But actually, it's really working a lot, and in many different areas. When you think of, we're very interested in the fund in mobility, for example. Mobility has a very wide spectrum of verticals, but when you think of automation, automated cars, autonomous driving, mapping, 3D mapping, etc., a lot of companies that work in that area in France are very interested in the Asian market, either because chip manufacturing means probably Taiwan or South Korea, or because there might be very interesting partnerships with companies like Sony or Samsung, for example. So Asia, because there are very interesting economic actors that are big players in the area of computer vision, chips, etc., makes it very interesting for French or European startup to look into that market. So now I would say that a lot of European companies are very, very attracted to the Asian market, and not only fascinated with China, really interested in the rest of the south of the Asian market.
I want to talk a little bit about policy and the support also from the public sector and frameworks and so on as well. What is the situation there in Europe? If you look here in Asia, obviously you already mentioned the digitalization of the economy, the fourth industrial revolution in South Korea, for example. President Moon has established a committee for the fourth industrial revolution to provide advice to the government and basically link the public and the private sector. Here in Japan, Prime Minister Abe and the Cabinet Office are talking about Society 5.0. Of course, there's lots of different keywords around basically the scope of this is growing. It's not just the economy, it's the whole society. Everyone individually is also affected. What's the latest there in Europe, and what's the thinking around that, and how does that impact what you're doing, and does it impact you in a positive or negative way?
I think it's very difficult because I was confronted to that question when I was myself a minister, a member of a government, and in charge of economic policy. It's very difficult because I think many challenges today do not work with a top-down administrative approach. So you cannot decide today that France will become #1 in AI, for example. That has no sense, because a lot depends on the vibrancy of the ecosystem, of the economic actors, etc. So it's very difficult for a government today to find out what it can do to foster the ecosystem. And also it's difficult because usually the economic cycle goes faster than the administrative thinking. And I think a lot of policymakers today are really at a loss. And it's easy to ask for a report about artificial intelligence or about automation, or about Industry 4.0. But it's easy to write reports, but it's not easy to implement the right policy in order to really support and root for the ecosystem. So I think today it's a big difficulty for governments, and I'm not sure that they are in the best position to really create the big champions of tomorrow. So what they can do and what they should do, I think, is really try to have a vision of the future and create the regulation that will make it possible for regional champions to grow and to exist. And just one example right now with an area which is very complicated, I think, to understand for the public authorities, is blockchain and cryptocurrency. And you can see that some governments, I think Japan was really at the vanguard in terms of regulation for a moment, with Bank of Japan, experimenting things, etc. So Asia was really, as a whole, a very good, interesting territory for blockchain or cryptocurrency experimentation. But you see that now Japanese or Korean government are more cautious. Singapore has become the heaven for ICOs and cryptocurrency experiments. But in Europe, we don't know exactly where we stand. We don't know what we're allowed to do. It's very complicated to know if a blockchain company can really strive in Europe. So if I were the government right now, I would really try, of course, to mitigate the risks, because there are risks attached to cryptocurrencies, of course. But blockchain being obviously a technology that will be very important in the future for foreign exchange transactions, so for the banking system, for all the notary applications, so land registration, these sort of things. I think as a public authority, I would really try to create a very good environment for local actors to be able to develop their activities and to test solutions, because this is going probably to be the next very big revolution. And if we are not able to have very good actors and very good experts of this topic, it's an issue. So I think that public authorities must facilitate the emergence of champions. That's what they should have in mind.
Yeah, thank you. I have one more question before I would like to open up also to the floor for questions and comments for the audience to you as well, which is in the previous chat you mentioned you also have some concerns about some larger companies, foreign multinationals from the US or China, for example, becoming more and more powerful, kind of pushing some of the startups, budding startups aside and so on. Can you talk a little bit about these concerns and your current view on this issue?
Yeah, I think it's just starts with a very liberal economic thinking and approach. I think fair competition means that any newcomer could challenge the position of big incumbents. And actually, while these companies have been very talented and extremely interesting challengers to incumbents, now they're becoming incumbents themselves, and concentrating so much power, market power, money, also with business ethics that sometimes can be questioned, like with the privacy of data, with tax planning, all the things, makes me think that today it would be very sound if there could be a Japanese company that could compete with Amazon, or a Danish company that could compete with Google, or not in the search business, but in other areas of business. So I think today the difficulty is that these companies have become multi-sectorial monopolies. It's very, very difficult to regulate, because we know how to regulate gas or banking, but we don't know to regulate the companies that does DNA sequencing and insurance and send people to the space. So it's very complicated to apprehend this kind of business. But I think it would be better from a liberal point of view if other regions were able to grow champions that could compete with these companies. And I think at the moment it's becoming more and more difficult, because the winner-takes-all effect makes it very complicated to challenge their positions. So that's what I mean, and that's the reason why I think that if European and Asian manage to build the adequate and the right alliances, maybe they could be significant competitors to these companies in the future. That's a challenge, but it's my hope.
Okay, thank you very much. Now let's open up to questions and comments from the audience. Is there anyone who would like to ask a question? I see one hand going up there. Can we have a microphone, please, with a question for Fleur? Or maybe without? Okay. So the question is, what is Fleur's investment philosophy, looking at what is a successful company? So that's the question.
So our investment theory focuses on companies that have a tech dimension. So we would not invest in a new, bakery chain, for example. So it must have a tech dimension. preferably disruptive tech dimension. We are quite agnostic in terms of sectors. We would not invest in sectors where the investment cycles are very specific, like biotechnologies, or where you develop a molecule, it's going to take a long time to go to the market. So we would not invest in that, but we would invest in all kinds of sectors. With a focus right now on, I was mentioning mobility. I think mobility is a really interesting topic right now. Of course, it goes from computer vision to multimodal urban transportation platforms. So it's very different. You talk about very different verticals, but it's a very interesting, I think, area of investment right now. We're very interested in blockchain, as I was saying, because we believe that it's going to be a strong market to drive in the coming years. And as for the size and maturity of companies, because our value proposition is to help the company grow their business to Asia, for example, then it requires more mature companies. So we don't have that many early stage companies. We would be more interested in Series B, Series C growth segment. And in our portfolio, we have now about 10 companies. The biggest are already worth almost $1 billion, so almost unicorns. Taxify is almost worth $1 billion. And the smallest would be companies that are between 50 and 100 million euros valuation. So we don't do seed. It's really a late stage and growth.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Yeah. Please.
Hi, hello. Do you have any geographical restrictions, or you're focused on the overall Europe, or was it more like Western European countries?
Sorry, I didn't get the beginning.
Do you have any geographical constraints in your investments?
No, so yes, we have. It's Europe only, but Europe as a continent. So right now we have an Estonian company. We have a company that is incorporated in Netherlands. We looked into a Spanish company, so all over Europe. But for the moment, it's for the first fund, it's our constraint. But we might, when we raise a second fund, we will probably extend and be able to invest maybe in the US or in Israel. So
no, I'm fine. I consider myself European. So can we have a chat afterwards, perhaps, after your?
Okay, if you have any follow-up questions on a personal note and after the session. Anyone else who would like to ask a question or perhaps make a comment? It's a bit hard to see from the stage if anyone else is raising his or her hand. Okay, while you are thinking, maybe I can get one more question for myself then, which is obviously you've mentioned your two main investors from South Korea. Going forward, so kind of what's your ideal, what's your plan? Where would you like to attract more investment from into Europe? Are you looking at perhaps getting investors here in Japan on board as well, or other Asian countries? Are you looking at China at any rate, etc.? If you could just share your thoughts there.
So yeah, we would definitely look at the whole Southeast or Northeast Asian region. I'll probably go and visit Singapore, Hong Kong, Malaysia, and we'll try to meet with big sovereign funds that have interest in technology, Kazana, Temasek, this kind of potential investors. Also, corporations could be interesting. We have a very unique relationship with Naver and Line, so it's going to be difficult to find exactly the same kind of business relationship and strategic vision, but we would definitely be open to other geographies and other types of investors.
All right. Anyone who came up with a question in the meantime? Yes, please. Can we have a mic over there? Or perhaps you just say the question, I'll repeat it for you. It may take a while to get the mic to you. Okay, the mic's coming. All right.
Thank you. You said that policymakers sometimes are at a loss about such disruptions, innovations, and these fast things. And of course, an example of policy making is French tech, which has a very big visible presence and so forth. And many governments try to emulate that. And it seems that tech companies sometimes are a bit uncomfortable in front of governments. They want to look nice to them, and government wants to look nice as well. But it seems like sometimes the government is a hurdle rather than an incentive. So how do you view French tech today, now that you are in the private sector? And how do you view such initiative in general, a public initiative? Thank you.
Yeah, that's why, exactly, you're right. That's why I was saying that governments today should be facilitators or should be smart regulators rather than trying to, by direct policies or direct actions, trying to achieve results that they are not supposed to achieve. I don't think today it's for the governments to say we should have a major champion in France in AI, for example. I mean, of course, everybody shares that goal in France, but the state cannot do anything about that. So, I know that when I was, it was really something that was worrying me a lot, and I did a lot of thinking about that when I was minister, because I didn't want an administrative and top-down approach. And when I worked, for example, in order to ease the ecosystem, the environment for the business, for the founders and startups, I really thought about different sets of measures that could make it easier to create a business without trying to orient or to give a direction to the people. But for example, I worked a lot on, I saw that there was an issue on the financing aspect, because in France there's quite a lot of money in seed, for seed stages, but not so much money for late stages. So, for example, when we designed a new public bank for investment, we decided that we were going to create a large venture fund to try to solve this market failure of the problem of financing of large ventures. I realized that there was also a tax environment that was not an incentive for founders who I think should reinvest in the ecosystem. So we changed the capital gains taxation system in order to incentivize business creators to reinvest in other companies, in other businesses as angels or as investors. So, there's not one measure, but different kinds of measure that would encourage the creation and encourage business creation and startups. So I think that's how the state should behave. I mean, trying to give the best environment, but not trying to give precise directions like you're going to be number one now in AI or in robots or whatever. I don't think the states can do that because they always are late compared to the market.
Okay, I guess we have maybe time for one more question. Anyone who would like to take this opportunity? Last question for this session. Okay, otherwise I'll go for the opportunity. There's one more thing I wanted to ask. And coming back basically to the beginning of the session, we talked a little bit about the ecosystem in general. So far we've talked about a number of stakeholders, government, investors, of course the startups themselves. But there's more players obviously in any ecosystem. If you think about universities, individual people and so on, consumers, etc. as well. When you look at Europe, and again when you look at the ecosystem here as well, what kind of other important players do you see, and how does that have an impact on your work?
So I really try to have a permanent link with fundamental research in France, because I think even though some areas of research are really very far from products and markets, but it gives you a sort of feeling of what, in what direction the science is going. So I think it's quite important to have that link. Maybe when you look at France, the question of transfer, so going from fundamental research to creating a business and addressing a market is a bit difficult. I think it's working quite well in Germany with the Fraunhofer Institutes, but it's probably an area where, because we have a very good fundamental research in France, it's probably an area where we should facilitate movement, exchanges, bridges between fundamental research and business. Because when you're a good researcher, you're not necessarily a good manager, and you need to get these skills. Either you take from outside, or you have opportunities to go to business schools or to work in projects together with people who have other skills. So we're trying right now. It's something that has been going on for quite a while, but we try to facilitate cross-disciplinary groups, for example, engineering school and business school, they have common incubators for people who want to create businesses. So there was one engineer partnering with one business students, for example. I see a lot of research lab also who try to have partnerships with business schools. So this cross-fertilization, I think, is very, very important. And because we have a great academic environment in Europe, I think it's something that should work better. But definitely, it's probably more efficient in the US, for example, where you see a lot of professors involved, even as business angels sometimes, in the creation of businesses by their students. So that's really the organic link between academics and business is probably more advanced and should work as an example in Europe.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for attending the session.
Thank you.